Just a a sensible kind of approach, like which is more sensible.
Sure. Now what you're doing is this. You're again doing something in which you are conflating philosophical and methodological by saying the success of methodological leads to philosophical. People of Speaker's Corner, I want to share something with you. I want to share something amazing about us, human beings. Now recently there was an interesting study done on mice. And what the study did was this. It showed mice a berry. And every single time the mice saw this berry, they got an electric shock. So they started associating every single time that they look at this berry, they're going to get a shock. And as you can imagine, over a series of days or weeks or months, the mice became terrified of that berry. Now what's interesting is these same mice, when they had children and these were cut off from the parents, so they were not taught to fear that berry. Every time they see it, they get a shock. Instead, they are taught nothing, and they are cut off from their parents, and they are never shown that berry before, and they're never electrocuted for that berry before. Yet those children, when those children, the children of the mice, when they see that berry for the very first time, they run away and are scared. Meaning what? Meaning they have inherited something that their parents had learnt, which was to fear when they see a particular berry. Now this is an example, one small example of just how intricate the design of the human genome is. And if you imagine these things which are called epigenetic tags, this plasticity in which we can change, this not only exists in the animal kingdom, this also exists in human beings. And when you think deeply about the design that's within the human being, about the functionality of the human being, about the way that we can actually learn, it is actually mind-blowing, and it is way more complicated, way more sophisticated, way more something of which we should be in awe than any latest technology that we grovel over. The reality is the design of the human body and the design of all of us here is a mark of a creator who has created us with a particular purpose. Yet today in society, we have people who say this is not true and that there is no God. Yet when you actually think about it, when you actually logically ponder about it, there is no other rational possibility except to accept that there is a creator. No other possibility is satisfactory. No other alternative makes sense. And not only is this something that we know through our reason, this is also something that we know deep down in our hearts as human beings. We know deep down that there is a creator. We know deep down there is a purpose to life. And we know deep down that this life is not all that there is. And the more we look into nature, we should not turn away from God. We should actually turn back to God. Why is that? The reason is because the word of God, the Quran, this is a word of God. Something which we recite, something which has two covers. But the world itself is also the word of God, because He said, be, and it is. So the world as we have it today, this is also a creation of God. And this creation of God is something which we should ponder about. And the Quran tells us repeatedly to look into nature, to look at the birds and how they fly, and to look into insects and to look into this animal kingdom and to understand that they live in communities like us. Now what's interesting is this, at a popular level, we are taught that we are nothing more than just apes. We are nothing more than just creations of nature, purely a product of blind natural selection. Yet when you think about it, there are some things which are very unique about human beings, which do not exist when we look out in nature. For one, what does God say in the Quran? God says that He preferred mankind over His other creation. And if you look at human beings, we can do what other creation cannot do. Tell me where you see ants or cockroaches or something else sitting around discussing philosophical ideas. Tell me about the parliament that exists amongst termites in which they discuss termite rights or abstract concepts. Tell me of a clothing store that exists for lions. Human beings, in our sociological behavior, in our anatomy, and in many other ways, we are distinct from the rest of nature. Yes, we have similarities, but we are also distinct. And this distinction primarily is because of our knowledge. And in fact, this is what God in the Quran points out when He creates human beings. The first thing God says is that He taught Adam, our father and the father of all human beings who are alive today, the names of all things. So it is actually knowledge. Yes, sir.
Do you still want an example of a complex social behaviour from other animals that aren't humans?
Sorry, sir. What are you saying?
Were you asking for an example of a complex social behaviour from animals that aren't humans?
No, because
What were you asking?
what I was saying was human beings have a distinction above the rest of nature. There are things about the human being which are distinct, and we are nothing. The whole narrative that we're nothing but apes, this narrative doesn't make sense.
Okay.
And
are you aware that apes, practice a barter economy when you give them a currency and then they practice prostitution for that currency in exchange for food?
But how does that prove that we have a common ancestor with them?
That's not evidence of a common ancestor, that's evidence of complex social behaviours within
Sure.
animals that aren't humans.
Sure.
And there isn't a vast qualitative difference between humans and other animals. We do have more complex social behaviours, but not qualitatively. There's an unresolvable gulf between us and apes.
So let's narrow this down, sir. Do you believe we are closely related to apes?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if we're closely related to apes, then our sociological behavior should be somewhat similar to them.
That depends.
Somewhat. It should be more.
In certain
We should have, so for example, our anatomy. If we have similarities, then we should also have similarities in terms of our biological behavior, correct?
Not necessarily, but
But sir,
you can find similarities in some contexts.
right. So sir, I want you to answer me this. Does it make sense that there are similarities between human beings and ants, which do not exist between human beings and chimpanzees? For example, you were talking about complex social behavior. Ants actually have entire colonies and entire cities, and they have empires. Ants also have economics, they also have funerals, they also have treason laws. And ants also have battlefield medication for their wounded. So ants, in terms of sociological behavior, are way closer to human beings than chimpanzees. But if we as human beings, but if we are supposed to be the third chimpanzee, if we're supposed to have a common ancestor with the apes, then our sociological behavior should be closest to them, not to the ants.
But why are you calling it a sociological behaviour when these behaviours that you observe in ants are a result of just their genes and very simple algorithms that result in these kind of complex behaviours?
Sir, the view that you're relating there, this particular view is outdated now. Genes don't determine our behavior totally.
No, but in ants they do.
Okay, sir, firstly, when it comes to behavior being determined, what we have to do is we have to first look at why they say that and then look at whether the evidence correlates to that. So here, sir, let me just explain this. As human beings, we are alive today. Is our sociological behavior programmed by our genes?
Yeah, it's predisposed by our genes, you could say.
Is it dictated?
Some of it's predisposed.
Okay, let me put it in the most boldest way. Is DNA destiny?
No.
No, fantastic. Okay, so DNA is not destiny. Now,
well,
we have...
I mean, in some senses it is. Like, for example, given your DNA, you can't, it's your destiny to always have 4 limbs, for example.
Given. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about complex sociological behavior. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing. We're supposed to have a common ancestor with the most recent common ancestor with the chimpanzee, correct? Right. So why is it, and this is what I'm pointing out, we have sociological behavior which is closest to ants, our intellectual behavior is closest to crows, our linguistic behavior is closest to songbirds, and we have some genetic similarities between us and pigs which don't exist between us and chimpanzees. For example, insulin from pigs was taken out and stuck in human beings and it worked. So why is it that we have these examples of homoplasies if we're supposed to have a common ancestor with the chimpanzee?
So, I mean, I need to like address each example in turn. Since you mentioned ants first,
sure.
Like what you mentioned about the division of labour within ants, that's not accomplished via a sociological mechanism, even though you call it sociology. That's accomplished by what you mentioned earlier, epigenetics. So basically, different ants are given different things to eat. Or it's accomplished by epigenetics.
Okay, so you're saying ants' behaviour is predetermined?
Yeah, well, to a much larger degree than is comparable between apes.
Where you began off, you said it's pre-programmed.
Well, in what context?
So we were told, okay, is human behavior pre-programmed or do you have a choice?
No, it isn't pre-programmed.
Okay, ants, is ant behavior pre-programmed?
Yeah, to a much larger degree it is.
Okay, so why is it that ants have laws of treason and some ants break those laws? Clearly it's not all genes.
Well, you're kind of giving it you're giving it quite an anthropological spin, or not anthropomorphic spin, when you call it like laws of treason. That makes us think, you know, they have this society where they understand these kind of laws and they create this juris system. It isn't that.
Do you know what happens to the ants that break? Do you know what happens to the ants that are treacherous?
They probably get marked with some chemical, then they get eaten.
They're actually executed.
Yeah.
Right? So clearly they do have a justice system of some sort.
Well, but that's our interpretation of just this chemical behavior.
Yeah, but hang on a second. If we say that's just our interpretation of their chemical behavior, then that's true with all of science. It's just an interpretation of certain behaviors or certain chemicals or certain physical phenomena.
But we know with ants, given that their entire neuronal circuitry is just a very simple neural network, that's all their behaviors aren't based on kind of cognition or self-introspection like our behaviors.
No, but how can we say that?
These are kind of behaviors that kind of get developed simply by kind of quite more simple chemical pathways. Like I smell a particular pheromone, therefore I attack whatever's marked.
So no, but if what you're saying right now is true, then it's pre-programmed.
Yeah, in ants, their behavior is much more pre-programmed.
But when you say, look, the main point I was trying to get to is this. Whether we speak about pre-programming or not, because initially you began off with this pre-programmed and now you're saying somewhat it is, but that's irrelevant. The point is this: why do we have similarities between human beings and other creatures which don't exist with our most recent common ancestor? That doesn't make sense from the hypothesis of a human chimpanzee ancestry.
No, it doesn't. No, that's fine.
Yeah, it doesn't. You're right.
No, what I'm saying is, it doesn't provide kind of strong evidence against us not having a human chimpanzee.
No, what it does is this, sir, and challenge me if I'm wrong. Homology is an assumption. Right?
Can you define homology?
Okay, homology is defined 2 ways. So and this is good you asked the question. Homology before Darwin meant similarity in function and structure. That's all it meant. Now, after The Origin of Species was published, homology was defined as similarities due to common ancestry. So what I'm referring to is the second definition, that human chimpanzee ancestry is based on the assumption of homology. Do you agree?
So, I mean, I want to be clear about something. So one example would be like, if we look, there are 2 kind of things we could look at. We could look at kind of how much our genes match up, like our gene.
That's homology.
Code. Okay, and yeah, so that would be an
Yeah,
example
so
of evidence for our shared ancestry,
sure.
recent ancestry.
Let's break down each concept, right? So firstly, homology is an assumption. Do you agree?
The assumption that if you share more of your genome, then you're more closely related. You're saying that's an assumption.
Do you know tag? Do you know do tag?
Yeah, I mean,
Sure.
So you're dismissing homology. That would seem to make it mean that we can't have things like paternity tests. Paternity tests, under your definition, would be based solely on homology.
No, that would actually be circular reasoning, right? So let me just explain this.
Well, I'm asking you if you're dismissing this because you were dismissing homology being an example of things being related.
Sure. Now the thing is this, sir. When it comes to human chimp ancestry or human whatever ancestry, that assumption is known as homology, and it's the assumption that if there's similarities, this is due to common descent.
Similarities in what?
Similarities, it could be anatomically or linguistically or in terms of genetics. Right.
So the genetic one is, you know that there are similarities other places than where the genes are actually
Sure. Now it's a false analogy to compare that with paternity tests. And the reason is because when we start off with the assumption of homology, it's actually an assumption. It's not a prediction, it's not a conclusion. So if someone says similarities are due to common descent, similarities exist, therefore similarities are due to common descent, that's actually circular reasoning. Paternity test is not an example of homology. Homology is an assumption. No, sir.
It's not looking at the genome to see how similar it is.
Yes, it is, sir. But the thing is this, sir. There's a difference here. Human beings, when they do a test, they do it with a test of other human beings, correct?
Yes.
So we already know there's common ancestry. But when it comes to human chimp ancestry, it's actually, or in terms of the tree of life, it is an assumption. It is not something we begin off with that we know. There's actually a difference.
It's based on evidence.
Sir, there's actually a difference here. Look, let me explain this and then you can challenge it if you want.
I'll let you go on. My only thing was
No, sir.
paternity test, so you're carrying it on further.
Sir,
the test is
No,
homology.
that's a false analogy. I'll explain why it's a false analogy.
I disagree.
Okay, no, but sure, sir. But this is a really interesting question. Now, before we take this any...
The reason I brought it up is you said homology was an assertion that was, you seem to kind of disregard it on that basis. And I was saying, that's the very basis of paternity
Look,
test.
I'm going to say something. I'm going to... Okay, sure.
I was asking, do you
That's fine.
Do you question it?
Yes.
Do you question paternity test?
No, sir. That's a false analogy, but let me just explain.
No, but that was my question.
Let's begin off with something. I believe homology, human chimp ancestry is an assumption. Right? And I leave it there. Now, here's the claim I'm making. I believe it's a misunderstanding of the science to believe human chimp ancestry is true literally according to academia. Okay, so let me just ask you the question. Do you think biologists and philosophers of science, do you think they believe the science leads to human chimp ancestry being true literally? Okay, let me give you one reason why that's not true.
You think they don't say that?
No. I'm saying they say it's an assumption. And then they try to validate that assumption and see how far it takes them. They're not saying it's true literally, and I'll give you an example of that.
We wouldn't disagree with that.
No, but you are disagreeing, because you initially said they believe it to be true literally.
No, but there's a difference between thinking that something's true and thinking that science gives you certain proof.
Okay, I'll give you an example. Right? Tell me which one of these two statements you agree with. Human chimp ancestry is an assumption. Human chimp ancestry is true literally. Which one of these do you agree with?
That's a false dichotomy.
Why?
It's that we have a degree of belief in the proposition that humans and chimps have a shared recent common ancestor, and that degree of belief is based on evidence and reasoning.
That's absolutely fine, sir. But what you're doing there is this.
An assumption implies no evidence. You're just assuming for no reason.
The first thing you do in science is you have to begin off with a hypothesis and then you try and verify it.
Yeah.
Correct? So human chimp ancestry is an assumption which which scientists try and verify.
Well, a hypothesis that you
Right, okay. So what the claim I'm making is this. human chimp ancestry is not absolutely true according to scientists or philosophers of science. It is actually an assumption which they try and verify by looking at genomes and by looking at anatomy. And when they go out and do that, they do actually come across some issues. Now, one of the issues they come across is homoplasia, where you have similarities. Now, we were talking about the paternity test. That was to do with humans, where we know already that common ancestry is there because it happens in front of us. So that's a false analogy. But when I can bring in front of you two genomes, and I can ask you, James, right? James, right? I can say to you, James, do they share a common ancestor? Imagine they look 99% identical. Would you say yes or no?
You'd say that they probably do share.
Probably do. We know in genetics and in biochemistry of things which are identical which do not have a common ancestor.
Do you mean the entire genome or a particular
The recent common ancestor. So for example, the placental saber-toothed tiger and the marsupial saber-toothed tiger. When you look at them, they have a lot of similarities, striking. The placental saber-toothed tiger is closer to the kangaroo than it is to the marsupial saber-toothed tiger. Now, the similarities between human beings and pigs exist genetically, which do not exist between human beings and chimpanzees. So how do you explain this?
But overall, we possess a much greater overlap of our genes, like between chimps than we do between pigs.
Sure.
And the reason, and that's not based on an assumption. That's like the reason why that we believe that that's evidence for having a shared common ancestor is because genetically we look at how DNA behaves and we observe that kind of there's a certain normal rate of genetic mutation unless there's unless there's extra presence of mutagens. And so we know that, like, given that kind of DNA mutates at a certain rate over time, like the closer kind of two organisms are in DNA, that provides good evidence that they have a closer common ancestor. Because it'll be very rare that kind of two totally unrelated organisms would happen to mutate to become more similar.
Sure.
It'll be much more likely that they mutate to become less similar.
Sure.
So
what you
it could be that kind of a particular organism, like a pig, could by chance mutate a similar gene to an organism that it isn't very closely related to, just by chance. They both evolve that same gene independently. And that would be much less. That would happen much less frequently than a gene arising once and then being passed on to both new subsequent species.
Now, what you've explained there is the maximum likelihood method, which you're speaking there. All I'm actually saying about that particular method which they use, which is the conventional way they work out relationships of the tree of life. All I'm saying about that is it's still based on a number of assumptions.
Okay,
right?
Like,
so
all science and yet we still trust science.
I'm not saying not to trust it. What I'm saying is we should know and understand. It's not saying is that literally true.
Okay, but
okay, sir, one second.
That's not the
Sir. Now, maximum likelihood. Tell me which one of these assumptions is wrong in maximum likelihood. Firstly, there is the assumption that human beings, regardless of what evidence exists out there, we have a common ancestor with something out there naturally. That's just an assumption in science, which is naturalism. So we cannot accept a human being appeared in the history of life without being linked to something else. That's one assumption. The second assumption is of natural selection being the mechanism by which you have change. And I'm going to speak about this because this adds sub-assumptions. Okay, one second. Okay, homology is an assumption again, and the assumption of a single origin. Now, this assumption of natural selection...
None of those are... All of those are misrepresentations of what's believed in conventional biology.
How?
No one says...
Which one of these four?
Okay, could you repeat the first one? Because that was definitely wrong. Yeah.
Naturalism.
So could you repeat it just once more?
Okay, so for example, Gareth Nelson, he explains it best. He's an evolutionary biologist and an atheist. He says, we have to have ancestors as human beings. We'll pick those. Why? Because they're the best candidates and they have to be there. What he's basically saying there is, methodologically, because scientists ascribe to something known as naturalism, we have to have an ancestor, a non-human ancestor, with something natural out there. It's not possible, using science, to assume that human beings came in the history of life without being linked to something else natural.
No, like, what an astute scientist should say is that kind of, there is much more evidence that human beings arose via kind of these mechanisms, like kind of being reproduced. There's much more evidence for that than assuming that they popped out of the figment of some deity, and so we should adopt the assumption which best fits the evidence we have at hand. And so kind of, a much better working kind of model, the model we should adopt is that kind of, just like kind of, we were given birth to, kind of our previous organism was given birth to, we should kind of proceed in that view and adopt that model, rather than adopting a model which doesn't have any evidence to support it.
And what's that called?
From a book of, what's that called?
What's that called?
Being sensible, being logical.
No, it's not. It's actually called methodological naturalism.
Well, no, hold on. Methodological naturalism. There's two types, and your friend.
So you were supposed, but hang on a second. You were supposed to challenge the assumption, not verify it. You just verified it.
In what way?
You said I misrepresented, and these assumptions aren't there. But you just showed me yourself that assumption exists.
No, I didn't assume like there can be no such thing as magic. What I said was that the model that kind of human beings kind of were reproduced and like came about via reproduction rather than something magical or some kind of being's divine intervention or divine providence or molding people out of magical clay or that sort of thing. That there's much more evidence to support the model that human beings came about via,
what you're doing is this.
Natural processes. What you would call
what you're doing is this. You're conflating methodological naturalism with philosophical naturalism.
No,
you are. Shall I tell you why? Shall I tell you why? Because scientists, here's what they do. When they are looking at a particular subject, a patient, they put on the lenses of methodological naturalism. They assume there's no soul. They assume the brain is simply the mind the mind is simply the brain at work. This is known as methodological naturalism. Now, philosophical naturalism, the belief that nature is all that there's out there, you're conflating these two. Okay, now let's go back to what I said, and which is why I explained it. I wanted you to challenge it, but you haven't challenged it so far. I said that human chimpanzee ancestry or anything in the tree of life is still based upon these four assumptions. First thing I said is methodological naturalism, and so far you've only verified it. Not only have you verified it,
I've said that. No, I've not like taken it.
You've also shown that a common mistake which is done is you've confused that with philosophical naturalism.
No, I haven't. Like, I'm aware of like kind of the difference between methodological.
Fantastic.
Naturalism.
So James,
I've said that like one model has evidence to support it. The other model has no evidence.
No. That's an assumption. That's an assumption.
Okay. So what's the evidence to support kind of creationism?
Perfect. Let's stop there for a second. Now what's happened so far is this. You've agreed, scientists agree to methodological naturalism. Now you're asking you're making an argument for philosophical naturalism. Now,
I'm not. No.
You're saying why is creationism better than this, which is philosophical naturalism? Well, you're not saying that.
No, but like, so the way I would understand, if I said I'm a philosophical naturalist, then I would be asserting that kind of nothing in nature occurs through supernatural means or divine intervention. I'd just be kind of taking that as an assumption, rather than what I'm doing is I'm kind of looking at two different models for how we came about. One model which has kind of evidence supporting it, and the other model which just has
now, sir, what you're doing now is you're going beyond the remit of science.
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to be philosophical as well.
So let's leave that discussion about whether naturalism or supernaturalism is the best worldview to the end. All I was saying was methodological naturalism is an assumption in science.
It sounded like what you said was that philosophical naturalism is an assumption in science.
No.
Okay.
So we agree there.
Okay,
now, here's the thing. Even secular mainstream atheist philosophers of science and evolutionary biologists agree that methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism are not the same thing, and naturalism itself, philosophical naturalism, is an act of faith.
Yeah.
For example, I'm sure you've heard of Michael Roos, very prominent philosopher of science. This is what he says as well. Now let's move on to the other assumptions, because we know methodological naturalism is there. The other assumption is natural selection.
But hold on. I'm sorry, but like, by calling it an assumption, that there's an implication there that it's not based on evidence. Whereas, like, in fact, adopting the model that human beings arose just by biological processes, rather than is supported by evidence more than the model that human beings arose by divine intervention.
Okay, assuming.
So why are we calling it an assumption when it's really just a a sensible kind of approach? Like which is more sensible?
Sure. Now what you're doing is this. You're again doing something in which you are conflating philosophical and methodological by saying the success of methodological leads to philosophical.
But
that's what you've said.
No, because I'm not saying that I'm not saying we should claim it, because if I was assuming
didn't you say methodological?
If I was assuming philosophical naturalism, then I'd assume there can never be any divine intervention. Okay, I haven't done that. What I've said is that in terms of which model is more supported when it comes to the arrival of human beings. I have weighed up the evidence, and one model is more well supported.
The discussion.
That doesn't mean I'm ruling out any divine intervention in the future. So I'm not being a philosophical
the discussion about whether naturalism or supernaturalism best explains human beings, morality, consciousness, everything else, design, we can talk about in the end. For now, let's stick to these 4 assumptions. So methodological naturalism is there.
But it isn't a different question, though.
It is a similar question, but what we're speaking about here is this.
It relates very specifically to whether scientists are assuming that there can't be any divine intervention.
Sir, methodological naturalism is a working assumption in science. This is according to the standard understanding of all philosophers of science. If you don't disagree with that, you can. I'm just saying it's an assumption there.
Can I ask you something?
Now, wait 1 second, sir. Natural selection is another assumption because no amount of similarities in the world is enough to establish that you have common ancestry. You have to have a mechanism. Do you disagree or agree with that?
Okay, you repeat that, sorry?
So, no amount of similarities between human beings or chimpanzees, human beings or pigs, genetically or anatomically, are enough to establish common ancestry. You have to show a mechanism.
Yeah, that's definitely desirable, having a mechanism.
Not desirable. You actually have to have it necessarily.
Yeah, okay, that sounds sensible.
Okay, so that's also an assumption, that natural selection leads A to B.
No, it's not an assumption, because that also has evidence supporting it.
Sir, this is the way that science works. You begin off with an assumption or a hypothesis, then you try and verify it, correct?
But then can we call it a hypothesis? Because assumption has the implication that you're kind of leaping to a conclusion that's just based on a gut feeling or faith rather than based on a logical inference.
I agree.
Okay,
but
I agree. So let's say it's a logical inference.
No, but sir,
natural selection is a mechanism which
look, we have some good reasons for this. Number one, there is a lot of propaganda about natural selection and how efficient it is, which is total nonsense.
No, what you're referring to are kind of minor disagreements between kind of biologists who would all agree that there is ample evidence that humans and chimps share a common ancestor.
No, but sir,
so you're pointing to like slight differences.
Two points here. Number one.
You're making a of a molehill.
Human beings and chimpanzees, you cannot claim common ancestry unless you have a mechanism. You already agreed about that. Number two, natural selection, we've been taught for the last 150 years, has great explanatory power, but there's loads of evidence against it. And in fact, just 2 years ago, the Royal Society in London, the most prestigious science society in the world, a whole group of scientists came together, atheist evolutionary biologists, and guess what the main question was? Does natural selection work? So the public thinks natural selection works. Really?
Yes.
So what were they talking about?
They were talking about 2 different schools, the modern synthesis versus the extended synthesis.
Right,
yes.
Fantastic.
And they actually agree on like a great deal. They only have minor disagreements.
Wait, no, that's not true. That's not true.
Yes,
Hang on. The extended...
Would any of the biologists at that event dispute
natural
there
selection?
Is good evidence that humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor.
No.
So none of them would disagree on that.
None of them would.
Based on their evidence and their investigation.
Sure, sir, but that's complete red herring.
Why is it a red herring?
I'll explain why.
They share ample common ground.
Wait. All of them, they believe in human chimp ancestry. All of them were atheists. But here's what Eva Jablanka said.
Are you sure they're all atheists?
Sir, what I'm going to do is this. Whenever I try and reference atheists, I only use those ones who do not believe in God, who do not believe in intelligent design, do not believe in anything like that. Now, Eva Jablanka, here's what she says. She believes in a type of Lamarckian evolution. which is, as you know, an alternative to Darwinian evolution. Now, when she got up there and she tried to explain this, she got challenged by those who believe in Darwinism. Now, the point here is this: she was putting forward. What she was doing was this: she was putting forth an alternative, which was making them uneasy. Why? Because they automatically realized that by challenging Darwinism, 150 years of propaganda will be unraveled.
No, that's such
They understood that, which is also why, sir, when a secular atheist who recently died, Jerry Fodor, didn't believe in God, when he challenged Darwinian evolution, he was called a secular creationist, even though he didn't believe in God. What does that go to show you? There is pressure in academia by the Darwinists, by people.
Like who?
Okay. Read the book, The Altberg 16 by Susan Mazur. She's a Australian journalist. She went out, she interviewed Jerry Fodor and all these guys. This is what they said in their book, in the book, The Altberg 16. She says that when she was interviewing him, he said, I'm being called a secular creationist because I'm challenging Darwin. Now, here's what some other scientists think.
What do you mean by them challenging Darwin?
By them challenging Darwin, challenging natural selection.
But do you mean they're saying that natural selection doesn't happen, or are they saying that natural selection is one of the mechanisms by which biodiversity occurs, but there are other mechanisms, and they have been kind of underrepresented in
يا ديمة خير وعطاء ويمام نقاء وسخاء يا نجما شع فأبهجنا يا شعلة نور وضاء يا ديمة خير وعطاء ويمام نقاء